My name is Alara Vance. I'm 32 years old. For my father's celebration of life, I flew 6 hours across the country with a gift I had carved with my own hands. A box of rare juniper wood that held the truth of the last 2 years inside it. Before I could even find a place to set my coat down, my father, looking healthier than I had seen him in years, took the box from my hands, his smile tight and practiced. "Chloe gave me life, Alara," he said, his voice loud enough for the circle of listening friends and family to hear clearly. "You only bring me paperwork." He didn't even open it. He just slid the box onto a side table, cluttered with champagne flutes and decorative napkins, a piece of finished wood among the party's refuse. Then he turned his back on me to embrace my sister. I picked up the box, and I left. When they found out what was inside that box, what it had cost me, what it represented, and who had actually paid for the miracle that gave them their lives back, they boarded the first red-eye flight and flew 3,000 miles to the door of my new, empty laboratory. Before I take you back to the beginning, if this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt like your quietest sacrifices were also your most invisible, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if the story genuinely stays with you. And do me a favor, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It makes this whole thing feel a little less like shouting into the void. Now, let me take you back, not 5 years, but 2. To the day I learned the monster I'd spent my entire adult life studying was now living inside my own father. I grew up in a quiet, book-lined house in Boston, Massachusetts. My father, Dr. Alistair Vance, was a tenured professor of romantic literature. My mother, Catherine, a former art gallery director with a razor-sharp eye for aesthetics, and my older sister, Chloe, 3 years ahead of me and a universe away in spirit, was the sun the entire household orbited around. I don't say that with bitterness, not anymore. I say it because it is an objective, observable truth, as real as the laws of thermodynamics. Chloe was vibrant where I was still. She spun anecdotes at dinner parties while I refilled the wine glasses. She brought home stories of her travels, her social triumphs, her ever-growing online following, each one presented like a masterpiece for my parents to admire. I brought home published papers in dense, peer-reviewed journals. Dad would hold up his phone, showing everyone Chloe's latest Instagram post, a perfectly filtered sunset over a yoga retreat in Bali. "That's my girl," he'd beam, "bringing beauty into the world." My latest publication on synaptic degradation pathways would stay on his desk, unread, until my mother eventually filed it away in a cabinet she labeled, with a certain telling finality, "Ilara's work." There was this thing my mother used to say at gallery openings or faculty dinners. She'd gesture with her wine glass, first at Chloe, then at me. "Chloe has the gift of connection," she'd say with a warm, practiced smile. "And Ilara, well, Ilara has a gift for focus." Everyone would nod politely. They understood the code. One daughter was a joy, the other was an asset. The language never changed, neither did the implication. I went to Stanford for my PhD in genetics, graduated top of my class, and accepted a prestigious research fellowship in San Francisco. I packed my life into 3 suitcases and a dozen boxes of books and lab notes. The morning I left, my mother was arranging flowers in the foyer. I stood in the doorway and said, "I'm heading out, Mom." She didn't look up from a particularly stubborn peony, just said, "All right, dear, try to call. We worry when you get buried in that lab of yours." That was September 1st, the anniversary of the day I first isolated the protein sequence that would define my career. I didn't leave because I stopped loving them. I left because staying meant suffocating under the weight of a narrative I had no part in writing, and I was already running out of air. For the first year in San Francisco, I called home every Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, like clockwork. My mother answered most of the time, the conversations pleasant but superficial, skating over the surface of our lives. We'd talk about the weather, her garden, Chloe's latest brand partnership. My work was a conversational black hole, too complex, too niche. "It all sounds very impressive, dear," she'd say, a sentence that was both a compliment and a dismissal. Dad rarely came to the phone. "He's deep in his study," Mom would explain. "You know how he gets with his books." By the second year, the calls became less frequent. I'd get voicemail. I'd text Chloe about it. "They're just busy," she'd text back, often accompanied by a photo of her and our parents at some chic new restaurant. "Don't take it so personally, Ellie. You know how they are." A week later, another text. "You know, Dad feels like you chose your work over the family. He sees it as a kind of intellectual abandonment." I sent birthday gifts, Christmas packages, a first edition copy of Keats for Dad's library, a rare botanical print for Mom's office. I never heard a word about any of them. When I asked Chloe, I could almost hear the sigh through the phone. "Oh, Ellie, I think they appreciate the thought, but it's all a bit academic. It's not personal, you know?" The sentence hung in the air between us. A first edition of his favorite poet wasn't personal? That sentence felt less like a stone in my chest and more like a carefully placed scalpel, severing a nerve I didn't know was still active. Then, one afternoon, my Uncle Ben, my father's younger brother and a corporate lawyer, called me. We were discussing a patent filing for my lab when he said, casually, "By the way, Alistair won't shut up about that Keats book you sent. Has it in a glass case on his desk. Says it's the most thoughtful gift he's ever received." I went completely silent. The hum of the server farm in the next room suddenly sounded deafening. "Alara, you there?" "Ben." Chloe told me he barely noticed it. A long pause on his end of the line. Then, very carefully, my uncle said, "Alara, that's not what happened." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Not that day. But something fractured inside me, a hairline crack in the story I had been told my whole life, just wide enough to see a different, harsher light shining through. I started paying closer attention. I cross-referenced the things Chloe said with the small, infrequent pieces of information I got from Uncle Ben. The gap between her narrative and reality began to look like a canyon. "Mom and Dad are just not up for visitors, Ellie. They're trying to simplify their lives." A week later, Uncle Ben would mention the massive dinner party they'd thrown. I didn't have proof of malice yet, just a disquieting feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you realize someone has been subtly tilting all the paintings in your house, just a degree or two off-center, and then trying to convince you the walls themselves are crooked. They just don't think in those complex terms, Ellie. They're proud of you, of course, but from a distance. Chloe had said that to me once, her voice dripping with a kind of gentle pity. She was always saying she was sorry. "I'm sorry you feel left out. I'm sorry it's so hard for you to connect." It never once sounded like she meant it. It sounded like she was admiring a problem she had a hand in creating. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday in October, 2 years ago. I was 29, running a late-night gel electrophoresis, when my phone buzzed with Uncle Ben's name. His voice, usually so measured and calm, was tight with a tension I had never heard before. "Alara, I need you to sit down. I'm sending you a file." "I'm already sitting," I said, my eyes still fixed on the glowing bands of DNA separating in the gel. My world was, at that moment, orderly, predictable, governed by the laws of physics. That was about to end. "I'm at the hospital with your father," Ben said, and the floor dropped out from under my lab stool. "He had a fall. At first they thought it was a dizzy spell, but he's been having symptoms. Ataxia, cognitive slips. Your mother's been trying to hide it for months." The words came at me like shotgun pellets. Ataxia, cognitive slips. They weren't just medical terms. They were the chapter headings of the textbook I was currently writing. The monster. My monster. "Which hospital?" I asked, my voice suddenly a stranger's, stripped of all emotion, all affect. It was the voice I used when a trial failed, when a hypothesis collapsed. The voice of pure, cold analysis. He told me. Massachusetts General. I leaned against the cool metal of the lab bench, the faint hum of the machinery a bizarre counterpoint to the frantic screaming inside my own head. "How bad is it?" I whispered. "Bad enough that they're running a full genetic panel," he said. "His neurologist is a Dr. Anya Sharma. She's one of the best, but she's stumped. She mentioned something offhand, a rare familial protein misfolding disorder. Alara, it sounded like what you describe in your papers." Of course it did. I had discovered it. I had named the faulty gene, VNC1, after my own family, Vance Neurodegenerative Cascade. A piece of academic hubris I was coming to regret with every cell in my body. I had built my entire career on the elegant, brutal architecture of this disease, and I had never once considered that the blueprint might be in my own blood. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, which overlooked the distant, glittering lights of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I pulled up every scan, every piece of data from my father's patient portal, which Ben had given me access to. I stared at the MRI of his brain for hours. I could see it. The telltale atrophy in the cerebellum, the subtle lesions in the brainstem. To any other neurologist, it was a confusing mystery. To me, it was a signature. My signature. The official diagnosis came a week later. The call was a conference between Dr. Sharma, my parents, Chloe, and me. Dr. Sharma was brilliant, compassionate, but out of her depth. She explained the findings, the rarity, the lack of any approved treatment protocol. She called it a 1 in a million genetic anomaly. I stayed silent, listening to my own research being described back to me as a terrifying novelty. Then Chloe's voice filled the speakerphone, thick with emotion, perfectly modulated for performance. "So what do we do? What's the next step? We will do anything. We will fight this with everything we have." My mother sobbed quietly in the background. My father, his own voice slightly slurred, tried to comfort her. In the midst of their raw, messy human grief, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I switched from daughter to scientist. "Dr. Sharma," I said, my voice crisp, "have you considered a targeted oligonucleotide therapy? There's a preclinical trial in Switzerland at the Zurich Institute. It's designed to silence the messenger RNA from the VNC1 gene before it can be translated into the toxic protein. It's his only chance." The line went quiet. Then Dr. Sharma, her professional curiosity piqued, said, How would you know that, Dr. Vance? That trial is so new it hasn't even been published." I closed my eyes. "Because I designed it." My revelation was met with a stunned silence. It was a silence I knew well, the kind that follows a statement so far outside the established narrative that people's brains momentarily refuse to process it. Dr. Sharma was the first to recover. "My God," she whispered. "You're that Alara Vance. I've read your work. It's foundational." For a single fleeting second, I felt a flicker of professional pride. Then I heard my father's voice, confused and thin. "Ellie? What is she talking about?" Before I could explain, Chloe cut in, her voice a masterful blend of concern and control. "Okay, wow, Ellie, that's amazing. But let's not get bogged down in the technical stuff. This is about Dad. So, this treatment in Switzerland. Can we get him in?" Her question wasn't for me, the world's leading expert on the subject. It was for Dr. Sharma. It was a subtle but clear repositioning of power. I was a source of information. Chloe was the leader of the action. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics. The Zurich Institute agreed to accept my father on a compassionate use basis, but the cost was astronomical. The therapy was custom-made, a single dose synthesized specifically for his genetic makeup. The price tag, not including travel and extended care, was $500,000. Insurance, of course, wouldn't touch it. It was experimental, unapproved, a long shot. The number landed in the middle of our family like a meteorite, $500,000. My parents, comfortable but not wealthy, had a fraction of that in their retirement savings. A lifetime of literature and art had not prepared them for a price tag like that. Despair began to settle over the house, a thick, suffocating fog. And then, Chloe rose to the occasion. It was, I had to admit, her finest hour. She was born for this kind of crisis, public, emotional, and solvable with the power of social media. Within 48 hours, she had launched Alistair's Journey, a GoFundMe campaign complete with a professionally shot video. It featured soft focus footage of my father reading poetry in his sun-drenched study, old family photos, and a tearful, heartfelt appeal from Chloe herself. She spoke of her beloved father, the cruel, nameless disease that was stealing him from them, and the one glimmer of hope in a faraway land. She never mentioned my name. She never mentioned that the glimmer of hope was, in fact, my life's work. The campaign exploded. Chloe's millions of followers shared it, donated, and flooded the comments with prayers and heart emojis. News outlets picked up the story of the beautiful influencer fighting for her brilliant father's life. She was on morning shows, her face a mask of brave vulnerability. In every interview, she was the hero, the devoted daughter moving heaven and earth. My parents clung to her, to the campaign, to the influx of public support. It gave them what I could not, a simple, hopeful narrative. Chloe was their savior. The world agreed. Donations poured in, $10, $100, $1,000. It was an astonishing display of collective goodwill. But after the first month, the momentum slowed. The total plateaued at just over $50,000. It was an incredible sum, but it was a drop in the ocean. It was nowhere near enough. And as the hope in my parents' eyes began to flicker and dim, I sat alone in my lab 3,000 miles away, running the calculations. And I realized there was only one other asset in our family valuable enough to save my father's life. Mine. The decision didn't come in a flash of noble inspiration. It arrived quietly in the sterile, fluorescent hum of my laboratory after midnight. It settled upon me not as a choice, but as an inevitability, a logical conclusion to a data set I had been collecting my entire life. My father was dying. I had the cure. The cure had a price, and I had something to sell. For a decade, my research had been funded by grants, by the university, all aimed at public good. But I held the core patents, the intellectual property for the delivery mechanism, the synthetic viral vector that could carry the gene-silencing therapy across the blood-brain barrier. That was mine. It was the key. Not just for my father's disease, but for dozens of others. It was my legacy, my Nobel Prize, my contribution to the world. It was worth millions. I spent a week doing nothing. I'd go to the lab, stare at my data, and feel a cold, paralyzing dread. Selling the patents to a private corporation felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for. It would take my work out of the public domain and put it behind a corporate paywall. The therapy, when finally approved, would be sold for monstrous profits, accessible only to the wealthy. It was a devil's bargain. My father's life in exchange for the potential lives of countless strangers I would never meet. I ran the ethical calculus over and over. I tried to find another way. I looked into research grants, emergency funding, medical charities. Nothing came close. The clock was ticking. I could hear the disease progressing in my father's halting speech during our brief phone calls. The choice was clear. My professional ethics, or my father. My legacy, or my dad. It wasn't really a choice at all. On a cold Tuesday morning, I made the call. Not to a friendly university partner, but to a name I knew from industry conferences, a notoriously aggressive pharmaceutical giant, OmniGen. I asked for their head of acquisitions, a man named Marcus Thorne, work for years. I was wondering, when you work for years, I was wondering when you might decide to monetize. There was no pretense, no talk of healing or helping humanity. It was a transaction. I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. I adopted his language. I have a portfolio of intellectual property, I said, my voice steady and detached. A novel adeno-associated virus vector with unparalleled blood-brain barrier penetration. I'm prepared to discuss a full buyout of all related patents. He was silent for a moment. I could almost hear the gears turning, the dollar signs accumulating. "This is unexpected," he said, and for the first time, I heard a flicker of genuine excitement. "I'll be on a plane to San Francisco tomorrow." We met in a sterile, impersonal conference room downtown. It was just me, Marcus Thorne, and his team of lawyers. There were no pleasantries. I laid out my data. They saw the value immediately. The negotiation was brutal. They knew I was in a vulnerable position. They could sense the urgency, even though I tried to mask it with a veneer of professional calm. They lowballed me. I walked out. They called me back an hour later. We settled on a number. It was a fraction of what the patents were truly worth in the long run, but it was more than enough for my father, with a significant amount left over. They would own everything. My name would remain on the original papers, a footnote in scientific history, but the future of the technology, the profits, the credit, it would all belong to OmniGen. I sat there, looking at the contract that felt like the heaviest object in the world. It was the sale of my future. It was the death of my academic dream. And I signed it. I walked out of that conference room feeling hollowed out, like a building that had been stripped down to its studs. The check, a cashier's check for a sum so large it looked fake, was in a crisp manila envelope in my briefcase. It didn't feel like money. It felt like an epitaph. My first call wasn't to my family. It was to the one person I knew would understand the gravity and complexity of what I had just done, my Uncle Ben. He picked up on the second ring. "It's done," I said, my voice flat. I didn't need to explain what it was. I had called him the week before, walking him through the agonizing possibility of the sale. He had been the only one I'd told. His response then hadn't been judgment or surprise, but a quiet, lawyerly pragmatism. "Make sure you have your own counsel review OmniGen's paperwork," he'd advised. "Don't let them steamroll you." Now, his voice was gentle. "How are you, Alara?" It was a simple question, but it almost broke me. No one else had asked me that. To my family, I was a distant, unfeeling academic. To OmniGen, I was a variable in a financial equation. To Ben, I was just me. "I need your help," I said, pushing past the emotion. "I need to move the money, and I need it to be completely anonymous. No one can know it came from me, not my parents, especially not Chloe." He was quiet for a long moment. I could picture him in his office, leaning back in his leather chair, his mind already mapping out the legal pathways. "That's a complex request, Alara," he said finally. "Money of that size leaves a trail. To make it truly anonymous, it will require some creativity, a trust, a charitable foundation as a cutout. It can be done, but are you sure? Alistair and Catherine, they should know what you've done for them." "No," I said, the words sharper than I intended. "That's the one thing that is non-negotiable. They can't know. Chloe, she's given them hope. The fundraiser, the public support, it's what's keeping them going. If I come in now, with this, it will shatter that. It will become a referendum on me, on her, on our whole family dynamic. It will turn his cure into another battlefield. I can't do that to him. I won't." I was protecting them, I realized, not just from financial ruin, but from the ugliness of our own family's truth. Chloe needed to be the hero, and maybe, just maybe, I needed her to be the hero too. Because if she was the hero, then I could remain in the background, where I was comfortable. I could be the scientist, the problem solver. I didn't have to be the daughter. I didn't know how to be the daughter they wanted. Ben sighed. It was a heavy, weary sound. "I understand," he said, "but I don't like it. This level of self-abnegation, it comes at a cost, Alara." "Everything comes at a cost," I replied. "This one is just quantifiable." He agreed to help. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. Ben set up a blind trust, which then made a donation to an established medical charity. That charity, at Ben's direction, then made a large anonymous donation to Alistair's journey. It was clean, untraceable, and perfectly legal. I sat in Ben's office as he made the final transfer. I watched the number in my new bank account, a number that represented the sum total of my professional life, vanish. It moved through the digital ether, scrubbed of my identity, and reappeared on a brightly colored GoFundMe page, just another anonymous gift among thousands, albeit a much larger one. The progress bar on the campaign page jumped from 10% to 100% in an instant. The goal had been met. My father was going to Switzerland. My secret was safe. Ben hung up the phone and looked at me, his eyes full of a sorrow I couldn't yet allow myself to feel. "The eagle has landed," he said quietly. "God help us all." The news of the miracle donation hit my family like a lightning strike. Chloe called me, her voice breathless with a hysterical, joyous energy.
Ellie, you're not going to believe this. Some angel, just donated the rest of the money. All of it. Can you believe it? We're going to Switzerland!
She was weeping with what sounded like genuine relief, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something close to warmth. The end goal had been achieved. That's what mattered. "That's incredible news, Chloe," I said, my voice even. "I'm so happy for Dad."
Happy?
She said, the laughter in her voice a little too bright.
I'm a wreck! I've been on the phone with the morning shows all day. Everyone wants the story of the anonymous angel. It's given the campaign a whole new life.
And just like that, the warmth vanished, replaced by a familiar, cold resignation. It wasn't just about Dad anymore. It was about the story. My anonymous, multi-million-dollar sacrifice had just become the heroic climax to Chloe's story. The narrative was now perfect. The devoted daughter launches a campaign, inspires the world, and her faith is rewarded by an anonymous benefactor, a testament to the power of her love. My parents were ecstatic. They called me right after Chloe, their voices overlapping in their excitement. "Isn't it wonderful, Alara?" my mother cried. "It's all thanks to Chloe. She never gave up hope. She manifested this miracle." My father's voice was stronger than I'd heard it in months. "Your sister, Alara, she's a force of nature. She saved my life." I listened, murmured my agreements, and felt a piece of me quietly walled off, brick by brick. They weren't just giving her the credit. They were building a monument to her on the foundations of my silent sacrifice. A few days later, just before they were scheduled to fly to Zurich, I had another call with my mother. I was trying to walk her through some of the technical aspects of the treatment, the potential side effects, the importance of the post-infusion monitoring. "Alara, darling," she interrupted gently, her voice strained with impatience. "That's all very clinical. We have doctors for that. What your sister needs right now is emotional support. This has all been so much for her to carry." I was stunned into silence. I was being clinical? I had designed the cure, and she was worried about the emotional toll on the person who had designed the fundraiser. The conversation ended with a pointed comment. "You know, dear, Chloe mentioned you haven't donated to the GoFundMe. I know you're not as financially comfortable as her, but every little bit helps show support. It's about the gesture." The irony was so staggering, so profoundly absurd, that I couldn't even summon the anger to respond. I, who had just funded 90% of the treatment, was being chastised for not making a $10 gesture. "I'll keep that in mind, Mom," I said, my voice a dead calm. I hung up the phone and looked around my small, sparse apartment. Most of my furniture was secondhand. My car was a decade old. I had poured every spare cent I ever had back into my research, the research I had just sold. The disconnect between their reality and mine was no longer a crack. It was a chasm. And I was standing on one side, entirely alone. The next 2 years were the longest of my life. My father's treatment in Switzerland was a slow, arduous process. Chloe went with them, of course. She chronicled every step of the journey on her Instagram. There were artfully composed photos of her holding my father's hand by his hospital bed, the Swiss Alps visible through the window. There were long, emotional captions about courage, hope, and the power of family. She used hashtags like #VanceStrong and #DadsJourney. She became a minor celebrity in the world of patient advocacy. A beautiful, eloquent face for a family in crisis. Her followers skyrocketed. My parents, isolated in a foreign country, relied on her for everything. She was their translator, their advocate, their connection to the outside world, and their emotional rock. My role was different. I was their remote, on-call encyclopedia. I had weekly calls with the Swiss medical team, analyzing my father's blood work, his MRI scans, his motor function tests. I would interpret the complex data and try to explain it to my parents in simple terms. I was the one who advised the doctors to adjust the dosage of his immunosuppressants. I was the one who identified a potential complication with his liver enzymes and suggested a course of action that they adopted. I was, in a very real sense, co-managing his treatment from 6,000 miles away. But my contributions were invisible. They happened in sterile emails and late-night phone calls with doctors who knew my work. To my family, my calls were an intrusion of cold, hard science into their emotional journey. "Alara, can we not talk about protein counts right now?" my mother would say, her voice weary. "Your father just had a good day. Chloe took him out into the garden. Let's just focus on that." Chloe would often text me after my calls with them. "Hey, maybe ease up on the medical jargon. You're stressing them out. They need positivity, not statistics." I was the voice of clinical reality, the bearer of complex truths they didn't want to hear. Chloe was the curator of their hope. One time, I tried to explain the significance of a new MRI result, a measurable reduction in cerebellar atrophy, the first hard evidence the therapy was working. I was ecstatic, professionally and personally. It was the breakthrough we had been praying for. "That's nice, dear," my father said, his voice distant. "Chloe just read me some of the beautiful comments people are leaving on her posts. So much love in the world." My data couldn't compete with her curated feed of public affection. My scientific miracle was less real to him than a heart emoji from a stranger. The isolation was profound. I was the architect of his survival, and I was being treated like a consultant. A difficult, slightly morbid consultant they were forced to deal with. I poured myself deeper into my work, starting a new lab from scratch with the portion of the OmniGen money I had kept for myself. It was my penance and my sanctuary. I worked 80-hour weeks. It was easier to map the human genome than it was to navigate the geography of my own family. The moment the distance hardened into something permanent and unbreakable happened about 18 months into the treatment. It wasn't a fight or a dramatic confrontation. It was, like most of the deepest cuts in my family, delivered quietly, secondhand, and wrapped in a veneer of concern. Uncle Ben called me, as he often did, just to check in. He was my only anchor to the truth, the only other person who knew the full story. He had just returned from a visit to Zurich to see my father. "He's doing remarkably well, Alara," Ben said, and I felt a genuine surge of relief. "The doctors are calling it a miracle. They're talking about remission." "The data's been pointing that way," I said, allowing a small measure of pride into my voice. "The therapy is holding." There was a pause. Then Ben said, his voice heavy with a reluctance I recognized, "Alara, there's something else. I had dinner with Catherine alone one night. She's worried about you." I braced myself. I knew this preamble. Worry, in my mother's vocabulary, was often a synonym for disapproval. "She sees how much Chloe is doing," he continued, choosing his words with legal precision. "How she's dedicated her life to this. How she's there every day, managing everything with such grace and love. And she sees you, buried in your new lab, so far away." I waited. I knew the punchline was coming. She said to me, and please know this is her anxiety talking, not her heart. She said, "Ben, Chloe saved her father with love. It's the most powerful force on earth. But I worry about Ilara. I worry her heart is as sterile as her laboratory. The line went dead quiet. I stared at the wall of my office, at the complex diagrams of genetic sequences I had taped up. Sterile. My heart was sterile. The word echoed in the silent room. All the work, all the sacrifice, the gut-wrenching decision to sell my future, all of it had been filtered through their narrative, and this was the result. Chloe's love was powerful and life-giving. My contribution, the very science that was physically knitting my father's brain back together, was perceived as something sterile, cold, lifeless. I had given up my soul for them, and they had diagnosed me as soulless. "Thank you for telling me, Ben," I said, my voice eerily calm. I was surprised at how steady it was. The pain was so immense, so absolute, it was beyond tears. It was a geological event, a tectonic plate shifting deep within me, creating a fault line that would never heal. "I have to go," I said. "I have an experiment running." I hung up the phone. I didn't have an experiment running. I just sat there in the dark, in my silent, sterile lab, and in that moment, I understood. In my own mother's eyes, my heart wasn't just quiet, it was empty. The news of my father's official remission came, predictably, not from a phone call, but from Chloe's Instagram. A professionally produced video appeared on my feed. It was a montage of triumphant moments. Dad walking without his cane, Dad laughing in a sunlit cafe, Mom and Dad embracing, with Chloe looking on, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. The soundtrack was an uplifting indie pop song. The final shot was a text overlay in elegant script. "The journey isn't over, but the miracle has arrived." It had 1 million views in the first hour. 2 weeks later, a new post. A beautiful calligraphed invitation. "Please join us in celebrating Alistair Vance's life and a new beginning." It listed a date, a time, and the address of my parents' home in Boston. It was a public announcement, posted for her entire network to see. Dozens of family, friends, and relatives commented. "Can't wait to celebrate! So thrilled for you all! Chloe, you made this happen!" I stared at my phone, a familiar dull ache settling in my chest. There was no personal text, no email, no phone call. I, the person whose work had made this celebration possible, had been invited the same way as a stranger who followed Chloe for her lifestyle tips. I was part of the general public. I sat with it for a day. I told myself it didn't matter. It was a party, a logistical oversight. They were busy. Chloe was managing everything. I made all the usual excuses for them, the same ones I had been making my entire life. But the excuse-making machinery in my brain was finally starting to break down. The wound from my mother's sterile heart comment was still raw. This wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. That evening, I called Chloe. She answered with the bright, slightly frazzled voice of a professional event planner. "Ellie, hi! Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I saw your post about the party for Dad. It looks wonderful." "Oh my God, it's been insane," she gushed. "Picking caterers, florists, you have no idea. But it's going to be perfect. Dad deserves it." "I'm sure he does," I said. I waited, giving her an opening. A space to say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. In all the chaos, I forgot to call you personally. Of course you're coming." The space remained empty. The silence stretched. Finally, I had to force it. "I just wanted to check on the details. I'll need to book a flight." Another pause. This one was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a sudden, palpable tension. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping an octave. I didn't really think you'd want to come." The words landed like tiny, sharp pebbles. "It's a party celebrating Dad's recovery, Chloe. Why wouldn't I want to come?" "Well, it's just, you know, it's going to be a party. Lots of people, very social. Not really your scene, is it? All that small talk. I just didn't want you to feel uncomfortable or awkward." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was framing my exclusion as an act of kindness, of protecting my delicate, introverted sensibilities. She had built the walls around me and was now pretending they were a sanctuary of my own choosing. In that moment, something inside me didn't just crack, it snapped. "I'll be there, Chloe," I said, my voice colder than I had ever heard it. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, not from anger, from a terrifying, liberating clarity. 2 years of silence, and my sister was still trying to convince me that my absence was my own choice. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my boyfriend Liam rolled over. He was a quiet, steady architect who had watched this whole saga unfold with a pained look in his eyes. "You're going, aren't you?" he asked. "Yeah." "Good," he said. He paused. "What are you going to bring as a gift?" I thought about it for exactly 1 second. The truth. He didn't ask what I meant by the truth. He didn't have to. Liam had been the silent witness to the late-night calls, the early morning data analysis, the sheer, crushing weight of the last 2 years. He had held me once, months ago, after a particularly cutting text from Chloe and said, "You know, Alara, the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And they aren't even giving you that. They're actively curating your irrelevance." It was a harsh, architectural assessment, and it was devastatingly accurate. Somewhere in that quiet, dark room, with his hand resting on my back, something inside me shifted from hoping to deciding. "You don't get to erase me from my own family, Chloe. Not anymore." The next morning, I called the only ally I had. "Ben, it's Alara." "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I saw the invitation. It's public." "That's one word for it," I said, a bitter smile touching my lips. "I need a favor. I need you to draw up a document for me." I could hear him shift in his chair, the faint creak of leather. "What kind of document?" "I need a bound, notarized, and certified copy of the full sales contract with Omnigen. Every page, every addendum, and I need a separate notarized statement from you, as the facilitating attorney, confirming the exact path of the funds from the initial sale, through the blind trust, to the final donation into the Alistair's Journey account." There was a long silence on the line. It was a lawyer's silence, a silence that was weighing precedent and consequence. "Alara," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "that document is a declaration of war." "No, it's not," I countered, my own voice surprising me with its strength. "It's a lab report. It's just the data. Cold, hard, verifiable data. They've spent 2 years living in a world of curated narratives and emotional appeals. I'm just bringing the facts. What they do with them, that's on them." He didn't argue. He knew me well enough to know that once my course was set by logic, it was immutable. "All right," he said. "But you need to think about what you want the outcome to be. What's your goal here, Alara? Vindication? An apology?" I thought about it for a long time, looking out my window at the fog rolling in over the bay. What did I want? The answer, when it came, was simple and stark. I want them to see me, I said quietly. Not the idea of me, not the version of me Chloe created for them. I want them to, for one single moment, see me. And the only way to do that is to show them the one thing I did that they can't ignore or misinterpret. I wanted them to see my work. Because my work, in the end, was my heart. It wasn't sterile. It was the most alive, most passionate part of me, and I had sacrificed it for them. Give me 2 days, Ben said. It will be ready. I'll have it delivered to your hotel in Boston. I hung up, my resolve hardening into something that felt like bedrock. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The restoration of my own existence within my own family. The package from Ben arrived at my hotel the morning of the party. It wasn't an envelope. It was a slender, heavy box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the document he'd prepared. It was bound in dark blue leather, the title embossed in simple gold leaf. Financial Statement Regarding the Treatment of Alistair Vance. It was formal, formidable, and undeniable. Beneath it lay the gift I had spent the last week preparing. A box. Not a gift-wrapped store-bought box, but one I had made myself. It was carved from a single block of juniper wood. The scent, sharp, clean, and nostalgic, filled the hotel room. Woodworking was one of the few things my father and I had ever truly shared. When I was a teenager, before the silence between us became a permanent fixture, he had a workshop in the basement. He taught me how to use a lathe, how to read the grain of the wood, how to sand it down until it felt like silk. He loved juniper. It holds its scent for 100 years, Ellie, he'd told me. It's a wood that remembers. I had spent every evening after work in a small rented workshop carving that box. My hands, more accustomed to the delicate precision of a micropipette, quickly remembered the familiar feel of the chisel and the rasp. I carved it with interlocking patterns of DNA helices, so subtle they were almost invisible unless the light hit them just right. It was a fusion of his world and mine. It was the most personal thing I had ever made. It was a message only he should have been able to understand. I remember. I am still your daughter. I placed the heavy leather-bound document inside. It fit perfectly. The cold, hard facts of the transaction nestled within the warm, fragrant wood of my memory. The truth, wrapped in love. I closed the lid. The 2 pieces of wood met with a quiet, satisfying click. That afternoon, as I got ready, I felt a strange calm. The anxiety and hurt that had been my constant companions for 2 years had receded, replaced by a kind of scientific detachment. I was an observer now, about to introduce a new, powerful variable into a closed system. The outcome was unknown, but the experiment itself was necessary. Liam called me just as I was about to leave. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I'm about to publish a paper I know is going to be incredibly controversial," I said. He laughed, a short, warm sound. "Well, you've got your data. You've been peer-reviewed by the only person who matters. You." He was right. Uncle Ben was my co-author, but I was the principal investigator of this particular study. "Whatever happens, Alara," Liam said, his voice serious now, "you're not defined by their reaction. The work is already done. The sacrifice is already made. This part? This is just the presentation of findings." I took a deep breath, picked up the juniper box, and walked out the door. The work was done. He was right. I wasn't going there to ask for anything. I was going there to report my findings. The flight from San Francisco to Boston felt like a journey through a time warp. One moment, I was surrounded by the relentless, forward-looking energy of Silicon Valley, a place where legacies were built on data and disruption. The next, I was descending into the old, storied landscape of New England, a place where legacies were inherited, where narratives were polished like old silver and passed down through generations. My family's narrative was a Boston narrative, Brahmin intellectualism, quiet good taste, and the unspoken rule that messy emotions were to be handled with the same discreet efficiency as household repairs. You didn't air your grievances. You called the appropriate specialist and had them dealt with quietly. For 2 years, I had been a grievance they had chosen not to address. I held the juniper box on my lap for the entire 6-hour flight. The flight attendants offered to stow it for me, but I refused. Its weight was a comfort. It felt solid, real, a tangible counterpoint to the phantom-like existence I seemed to hold in my family's consciousness. I ran my thumb over the smooth, carved surface, tracing the hidden double helices. I thought about the irony of it all. I study the language of genetics, the code that writes the story of who we are. A single misplaced protein can change a family's destiny. A single gene, VNC1, had rewritten ours. But families have another code, an unwritten one, a code of myths and roles assigned at birth. In our family's code, Chloe was the protagonist. I was a supporting character, a specialist brought in for technical exposition. The problem was, I had written the cure. The supporting character had hijacked the plot, and the protagonist hadn't even noticed. I didn't read or watch a movie. I just watched the clouds, a sea of white that looked soft and forgiving, a stark contrast to the turbulence I felt inside. Was Ben right? Was this a declaration of war? I didn't feel warlike. I felt like a scientist who had discovered a fundamental error in a long-accepted theory and felt a professional, ethical, and personal obligation to correct the record. It wasn't about malice. It was about accuracy. Their love for Chloe was built on a foundation of false data. My estrangement from them was built on a foundation of missing data. All I was doing was providing the complete dataset. A part of me, a small, stubborn, unscientific part, still hoped they would see the box, smell the juniper, and understand the message before they even saw what was inside. It was the last flicker of the girl who had wanted her father's approval, the girl who believed love could be communicated through a shared, silent language. By the time the plane began its descent over Boston Harbor, that flicker was gone, replaced by the cool, steady glow of resolve. The time for silent languages was over. It was time to speak plainly. My parents' house was exactly as I remembered, but amplified. It was crowded, loud, and oppressively cheerful. A large banner proclaiming "Alistair's New Beginning" hung in the foyer. Waiters moved through the throngs of people with trays of champagne. Everyone was dressed in expensive, celebratory clothes. It looked less like a family party and more like a fundraising gala for a cause that had already won. I walked in, and the juniper box in my hands immediately felt out of place, too rustic, too real for this glossy, curated event. My presence created a small, awkward ripple in the social fabric. Conversations near the door faltered. A few of my parents' old friends, People who had known me since I was a child gave me tight, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I was an anomaly, a variable they hadn't accounted for in their celebration. I was the ghost of a daughter they had conveniently forgotten. I scanned the room looking for my parents, for Chloe, but I found Uncle Ben first. He was standing near the fireplace, a glass of club soda in his hand, looking deeply uncomfortable. He saw me, and his eyes met mine over the heads of the crowd. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of encouragement. It was a nod of acknowledgement, the kind one soldier gives another before a battle. I'm here. I see you. Let's get this over with. Then I saw them. My father was holding court, surrounded by a circle of his former university colleagues. He looked wonderful. His color was back, his posture was straight, and he was laughing, a full, booming laugh I hadn't heard in years. My mother was at his side, her hand on his arm, looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. And Chloe stood just behind them, radiant in a cream-colored dress, accepting congratulations like a triumphant general. Just as I started to move towards them, Chloe stepped onto the small makeshift stage by the grand piano. She tapped a champagne flute with a spoon, and a hush fell over the room. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice thick with practiced emotion. "I just want to thank you all for being here to celebrate the most important man in my life." She launched into a beautiful, moving speech. She spoke of the darkness of the diagnosis, the terror, the hopelessness. She painted a vivid picture of their struggle. Then, her voice swelling, she spoke of the campaign. "When we were lost," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "you all, this community, our friends, and even strangers from around the world, you lifted us up. You showed us the power of hope. You gave us this miracle." The room was silent, captivated. People were dabbing their eyes. My father looked at her, his own eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "This journey has taught me so much," she concluded, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But most of all, it has taught me that love is the most powerful medicine of all. To Dad, and to the power of love." The room erupted in applause. "To Chloe!" someone shouted. "To Chloe!" the room echoed. And in that moment, standing there in the shadows, holding the silent truth in a juniper box, I had never felt more invisible in my entire life. The applause died down, and the celebratory hum of the party resumed. This was it. The narrative had been publicly solidified. The myth had been cast in bronze. Now, it was time for the data. I moved through the crowd, a quiet, determined ship parting a sea of champagne and small talk. The circle around my father opened as I approached. He saw me, and for a half-second a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Surprise, maybe confusion. Then the mask of the genial host snapped back into place. "Alara," he said, his tone a little too loud, a little too hearty. "You made it. We weren't sure you would." My mother turned, her smile faltering for a beat when she saw the juniper box in my hands. Chloe moved to my father's side, a proprietary arm slipping around his waist, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. It was a silent, territorial gesture. "He's mine." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, my voice steady. "I brought you a gift, Dad." I held out the box. The scent of juniper, clean and sharp, cut through the perfumed air of the party. He took it from me, his brow furrowed in mild curiosity. He ran a hand over the surface, and I held my breath, waiting for a spark of recognition, a memory of the workshop, of our shared hours. Nothing. It was just a wooden box to him. "It's lovely, dear," my mother said, filling the awkward silence. "You shouldn't have." My father turned the box over in his hands. He seemed disappointed, as if he'd been expecting something more in line with the party's lavish aesthetic. He tried to open it, fumbled with the seamless lid, and a flash of impatience crossed his face. "Here," Chloe said, reaching for it. But I stepped forward. "It's for Dad." He finally got the lid open. He looked inside. He saw the leather-bound document, the gold-embossed formal title. His face fell. The flicker of curiosity was replaced by a look of profound, weary disappointment. He lifted the heavy document out, glanced at the cover, and then looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw 2 years of curated resentment, of Chloe's whispers and my own silence, crystallize into a single, cutting judgment. "Chloe gave me life, Alara," he said, his voice not angry, but laden with the heavy weight of his disappointment in me. He said it for the benefit of his audience, for the circle of friends watching this strange family drama unfold. "You only bring me paperwork." He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He did something far worse. With a quiet, dismissive gesture, he slid the juniper box and the leather-bound truth it contained onto the cluttered side table. It landed with a soft wooden thud. He pushed my life's work, my sacrifice, my heart, into a pile of used cocktail napkins. Then he turned his back to me, pulled Chloe into a tight hug, and said, "Now, where were we?" The circle closed again, leaving me on the outside. The room buzzed back to life around me. The moment had passed. No one had even noticed it had happened. I stood there for a full 10 seconds, the coldness spreading through my chest until I felt like I was encased in ice. Then, without a word, I turned and walked toward the door. I could feel Ben's eyes on my back as I went. I didn't pick up the box. I left it there. My findings had been presented. The experiment was now in their hands. I didn't see what happened next, not with my own eyes. I was already out the door, walking down the cold Boston street, the sound of the party a faint, muffled beat behind me. I didn't look back. Everything that follows is what Uncle Ben recounted to me, first in a brief, grim phone call that night, and later in painstaking detail. He told me he felt like he was watching the moments after a bomb had been planted. The room was humming along, blissfully unaware, while he was the only one who had seen the fuse being lit. He let me get clear of the house. He waited until the party had regained its rhythm. Then he walked over to the side table. He picked up the juniper box. He took out the leather-bound document. And then he walked to the center of the room, to the spot where Chloe had given her triumphant speech just 10 minutes earlier. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a lawyer's authority, a precise cutting edge that sliced through the chatter. The room quieted, people turning with expressions of mild curiosity. My father, who had been laughing at a story, turned, a look of annoyance on his face. "Ben, we're celebrating here." "I know," Ben said, holding up the document. "And I believe this belongs in the celebration." Chloe took a step forward, a tight, warning smile on her face. "Uncle Ben, this really isn't the time for whatever that is." "Oh, this is exactly the time," he said, his voice dropping, becoming graver. "This is a financial statement regarding the treatment of Alistair Vance, and I think you all, as donors and supporters, have a right to see the full accounting." A different kind of silence fell over the room now. It was a tense, expectant silence. Ben opened the leather-bound volume. He put on his reading glasses, a deliberate, theatrical gesture that commanded attention. "First," he said, his voice clear and steady, "let us acknowledge the GoFundMe campaign, Alistair's Journey, a remarkable success, which raised, through the generous donations of friends, family, and strangers, a total of $54,781. He paused, letting the number sink in. A noble effort. However, the total cost of the treatment, transport, and associated care in Zurich came to $500,000 even. He looked up, his eyes sweeping across the silent, staring faces. That leaves a shortfall of $445,219. He turned a page. On November 12th, 2 years ago, the campaign received a single anonymous donation for exactly that amount, $445,219. This was the miracle donation that made the treatment possible. My mother was staring at him, her hand gripping my father's arm. Chloe's face had gone rigid. "This document," Ben said, tapping the cover, "is the full, notarized record of the source of that anonymous donation." He looked directly at my father. "Alistair, Catherine, I'm about to read something that will be very difficult to hear, but the truth has been silent for far too long." Then, in his clear, methodical voice, he began to read the key clauses of the contract between Dr. Alara Vance and the OmniGen Pharmaceutical Corporation, detailing the complete and irrevocable sale of all intellectual property rights for the AAV9VNC silencing vector. He read the sale price. He read the date. And then he read from his own notarized statement, tracing the path of that money, step by step, from my name to my father's cure. Ben told me the silence that followed his words was unlike any he had ever experienced. It wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy, and filled with the thunderous sound of a family's foundational myth being systematically demolished. The 60 people in that room were no longer guests at a party. They were jurors who had just heard the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The verdict was guilty. Someone in the back of the room let out a soft, shocked gasp. One of my mother's oldest friends slowly sank into a nearby chair, her hand over her mouth. My father's colleagues, men who understood the brutal world of academic patents, were staring at him with a mixture of pity and horror. They understood what selling one's life's work meant. It was a form of intellectual suicide. My father, Ben said, didn't move. He stood frozen, his hand still holding his champagne flute, his face a mask of utter incomprehension. It was as if the words had been spoken in a language he didn't understand, yet the meaning was slowly, brutally filtering through. My mother was the first to break. She made a small, wounded sound, a strangled sob. She let go of my father's arm and took a stumbling step back, her eyes locked on Chloe. And Chloe, her face had gone a bloodless, waxy white. The vibrant, charismatic influencer had vanished, replaced by a cornered, terrified stranger. I helped, she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that barely carried. I managed everything. I did all the work. You managed a fundraiser that covered 10% of the cost, Ben said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of pure fact. The other 90% was a gift from the daughter you just allowed your father to dismiss as a bringer of paperwork. He closed the leather-bound book with a soft, final thud. The room began to turn. It was a slow, merciless tide of judgment. People who had been congratulating Chloe minutes before were now looking at her with cold, unveiled contempt. You could see the reevaluation happening in real time on their faces. The beautiful, tearful speeches, the artful Instagram posts, all of it was being recast in a new, hideous light. It wasn't love. It was performance. It wasn't sacrifice. It was theft. No one said a word to her. No one moved to comfort her. The silence around her was a punishment more profound than any accusation. And then she did the only thing she could do. She turned, and without a word, without a single glance at our parents, she walked quickly out of the room, through the kitchen, and out the back door. She didn't flee dramatically. She just evaporated, disappeared from the scene of the crime. Her disappearance broke the spell. My father slowly, carefully, set his champagne flute down on a table. His hand was shaking so violently that the glass rattled against the wood. He looked at my mother, his face a ruin of dawning comprehension and shame. He looked at Ben, and then his eyes drifted to the front door. The door I had walked through. The door he had, with his own cruel words, pushed me back out of. He sank onto the piano bench, a man hollowed out by the truth. The party was over. The guests, sensing the profound, private agony that was about to unfold, began to leave. They murmured quiet, awkward condolences, not congratulations. They left their coats and their glasses and slipped out into the night, abandoning the wreckage. Soon, it was just the three of them, my father, my mother, and my uncle, standing in a decorated room that now felt like a tomb. And on the table between them lay a juniper box and a leather-bound book, the silent legacy that had just screamed its truth into existence. Guilt, when it is absolute and undeniable, is a powerful and immediate catalyst. There was no debate, no denial, no attempt to rationalize what had happened. There was only the brutal, crushing weight of the truth. Ben told me my parents didn't speak for nearly an hour. They just sat in the ruins of the party, my mother weeping quietly, my father staring at the juniper box as if it were a bomb he had unknowingly held in his hands. He finally picked it up. He opened it again. This time, he didn't look at the document inside. He just held the wooden box, his thumb tracing the carved patterns. Ben said he saw a flicker of a memory cross his face, a ghost of the man who had once taught his quiet daughter how to read the grain of wood. Juniper, my father whispered, the word cracking. It remembers. My mother looked up, her face swollen with tears. What have we done, Alistair? He didn't have an answer. He just shook his head, a slow, continuous motion of profound self-recrimination. He finally looked at Ben, his eyes those of a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. She was here, he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. And I sent her away. Yes, you did, Ben said, his tone unforgiving. He knew this was no time for comfort. It was a time for consequences. My father stood up. There was a sudden, desperate urgency in his movements. He went to his study and came back with his laptop. He pulled up the airline websites. There were no more flights to San Francisco that night. The first one out was the 6 a.m. red-eye. Book it, he said to my mother. It wasn't a question. They packed a single small bag in silence. They didn't call Chloe. They didn't, at that point, even seem to remember they had another daughter. Their world had contracted to a single, horrifying point of focus. Me. The daughter they had wronged. They drove to Logan Airport in the middle of the night, the city lights flashing by the windows, illuminating their pale, grim faces. The flight itself, Ben imagined, must have been a form of purgatory. 6 hours in a dark, pressurized cabin, suspended between the life they had known and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. There was nothing to do but sit with the full, complete knowledge of their failure. Every dismissive comment, every ignored phone call, every bit of praise heaped upon Chloe while I was silently selling my soul. It must have played in their minds on a continuous, agonizing loop. They were flying across a continent, but the real journey was an internal one, a desperate, headlong flight back through 2 years of willful blindness. They weren't just flying to see me. They were flying to see if the daughter they had thrown away was even salvageable. They were flying to face the sterile-hearted monster they had created, only to discover that the monster was, in fact, them. They found me where I lived, in the lab. I had worked through the night, a frantic, focused energy, a better outlet for my pain than sleep. When they walked in at 7 a.m. Pacific time, looking rumpled and gray from their journey, I was calibrating a new gene sequencer. The lab wasn't prestigious. It was a small, rented space in a biotech incubator, filled with secondhand equipment I'd bought with the seed money I'd kept. It was the physical manifestation of a career starting over from scratch. The sterile, fluorescent light of the lab was unforgiving. It exposed the dark circles under their eyes, the deep-etched lines of guilt on their faces. They stood in the doorway, 2 ghosts from another life, looking utterly lost amidst the tools of my trade. My mother was clutching a small overnight bag. My father's hands were empty and clenched at his sides. "Alara," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. My father couldn't speak. He just looked at me, his face a canvas of shame. I didn't run to them. I didn't cry. I simply hit the save button on my computer, turned off the sequencer, and faced them. I leaned back against the lab bench, crossing my arms. I was in my element now. This was my space. They were the visitors. The power dynamic, for the first time in my life, had shifted. "You shouldn't have come," I said, my voice quiet but firm. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "We had to," my father managed to say, his voice raw. "What we did, what I said, there are no words." "No," I agreed. "There aren't." We stood there in a heavy, humming silence, broken only by the whir of a cooling fan. This was the moment I had both dreaded and craved, the confrontation. But it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, clinical, and devastatingly sad. My mother started to cry again, the kind of broken sobs that expect comfort. I offered none. I just watched, a scientist observing a reaction. Finally, I spoke. "I don't want an apology," I said, and the words surprised even me, but I knew they were true. An apology is a single event. It's a bandage on a severed limb. It doesn't fix anything. It just makes the person giving it feel better. They looked at me, confused. What else was there? "What I need," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "is different. If there is any chance for us to have a relationship, the terms have to change. The old ones are clearly broken." I looked my father in the eye. "I need you to see me. The person standing right here, not the daughter you wanted, not the quiet, difficult footnote to Chloe's story. Me." I pushed off the lab bench and walked over to a whiteboard, a habit ingrained from years of teaching. I picked up a marker. "The past is a sunk cost," I said, borrowing a term from economics. "It's gone, irretrievable. What matters is the future, and I won't go back to being invisible. So I don't need you to apologize for the past. I need you to show up for the future, my future, on my terms. I looked at them, my gaze unflinching. The air in the sterile lab was thick with the weight of unspoken history, but for the first time, it was also charged with the faint, terrifying possibility of a new beginning. That was 6 months ago. The rebuilding process has been slow. It's not a Hollywood ending. There was no single, tearful embrace that healed all wounds. Healing, I've learned, is more like lab work. It's incremental, tedious, and requires meticulous attention to detail. There are days of progress and days of frustrating setbacks. They didn't stay in San Francisco. They flew back to Boston that same day to face the rubble of their old lives. But they started showing up, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent efforts. My father calls me every Tuesday, not to talk about feelings, not at first. He calls to ask about my work. "Tell me about the new sequencer, Alara," he'll say. "Explain the methodology." And I do. I explain it in detail, and he listens. For the first time in my life, he is genuinely, actively listening. He is learning my language. My mother sends me articles she finds about biotech, about genetic engineering, with little handwritten notes. "Saw this and thought of you." They are trying to build a bridge into my world, a bridge they are constructing stone by painful stone. They came to visit last month. They didn't stay in a hotel. They stayed in my small guest room, and they asked for a tour of the lab. I walked them through it, explaining my new research, a project focused on making genetic therapies more accessible and affordable, a direct response to the ethical compromise I was forced to make. My father stood before my whiteboard, covered in my equations, and he didn't look disappointed. He looked odd. "All these years," he said quietly, to himself more than to me. "I thought your world was small. It's the biggest world I've ever seen." That, more than any apology, was the beginning of our repair. As for Chloe, she's a ghost. She moved to Europe, deactivated her social media, and cut off contact with almost everyone. I hear from Ben that she's trying to build a new life, one outside the spotlight she so desperately craved and that ultimately burned her. I don't feel anger towards her anymore. I mostly feel a strange, distant pity for someone who spent so long performing a life that she forgot to actually live one. The lesson in all of this isn't about the transactional nature of love. It's not that you can buy your family's affection with a grand sacrifice. The sacrifice was never the point. It was merely the catalyst, the undeniable data point that forced a broken system to reboot. My breakthrough wasn't selling my research. My breakthrough was refusing to be invisible anymore. I won them back not by giving up my work, but by finally forcing them to see the value of it, and by extension, the value of me. So what do you think? Was my decision to remain silent for 2 years an act of self-preservation? Or was it a form of enabling that allowed the lie to grow? It's the one variable in this whole experiment I still go back and forth on. Sometimes I believe it was the only way. Other times, I wonder if speaking up sooner would have saved us all a world of pain. There's no clean answer, I suppose. The human heart isn't a controlled environment. Let me know in the comments what you would have done. I genuinely love to hear your perspective. If this story meant something to you, if it made you feel seen, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you for staying with me, all the way to the end of the data. I'll see you in the next one.